For this assignment, we had to watch 4 different videos, and one of them talked about the Brown versus Board of Education case. This was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court ruled the U.S. state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools as unconstitutional, even if segregated schools are otherwise equal in quality. The picture you see now features a photo of a girl named Linda Brown. Her father, Oliver Brown, tried to enroll her and her sister in an all-white school and failed, simply because segregation laws had not existed yet. Segregated facilities were allowed according to the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision, separate but equal, so as long as the schools were equally as good, this was okay. The reason Oliver Brown did not want to send his child Linda Brown to an all-black school was because it was too far from their house. A lot of black children had to take the bus to school or they had to walk miles before they could get to their schools. If Linda Brown was allowed to attend the white school, it would be a lot easier on her family to get her to school every day. All of this was happening back in the 1950s, which means this was just 70 years ago. The Brown versus Board of Education happened in 1954, which effectively overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which was separate but equal. Racially segregated public education was deemed unconstitutional. Back in 1952, the court considered 5 different cases that is now known as the Brown versus Ferguson case. And in 1955, a plan to denounce all segregation in schools was announced, and it was supposed to occur at deliberate speed. The second video, Segregated by Design, talked about how inharmonious racial groups cannot live in the same cities, meaning people of different skin complexions could not live together. Places that had African Americans in it were redlined so that people know that they were dangerous. And what redlining means is it's usually a lower income area, which is filled of mostly people of color. The very first projects built under the U.S. Housing Authority were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive obstacle was Lyndon Baines Johnson. There were 3 separate projects for white people, black people, and Hispanics. The cities refused public services in black neighborhoods such as garbage disposal and water and sewage services. They even placed power plants in these neighborhoods. Putting power plants in these neighborhoods was dangerous because most of these people did not have access to a doctor, and they often got sick from all the fumes and all the toxins that were being released into their air. Not taking out all the garbage and helping with the sewage also led to these areas being known more as the slums, or the ghetto as we call them today. It does not surprise me that black people were put in the ghetto before even receiving a chance to integrate with the rest of society because white people saw black people as dirty, or any person that wasn't white was seen as dirty. There was a law put in place to keep black people back, and they could not receive insurance because of this. In fact, it was harder for African Americans to get mortgages at the time, in most situations. The third source, Where Did All the Integrated Schools Go and Why?, was written back in 2017, and it made it clear that people were still clinging to their segregated charter schools and pushing for segregated school vouchers and lobbying to increase segregation at our traditional public schools. The article also talked about school choice, and what school choice was it was invented during this time as an explicit attempt to avoid desegregation. Charter schools and school vouchers are modern terms that could almost as easily be used to describe the multifarious, discriminatory attempts to stop racial mixing by reference to choice. It's 2020 and there are still some parents that don't want their children going to school with somebody that's black simply because they're not the same skin tone as their child. Statistics actually show that classrooms were the most diverse from the 1970s to the early 1990s. And personally, I have noticed this in a lot of my schools since I moved from Brooklyn. When I was in Brooklyn, I went from being the majority in my school to moving to New Jersey and being the minority. It's just always been kind of crazy to me that teachers preach diversity and most of our classes consist of white people. I never really expected my peers to understand, but being the only black person in the majority of my classes always makes conversations like this very uncomfortable because a majority of the time, I feel like I'm being pitied and that they're not going to actually understand what it's like. The government was actually allocating tax dollars to parents so they could choose to send their child to a more private school that won't accept minorities. With this also came privatization, which just means reducing accountability and transparency for how tax dollars are spent, which means that corporations can pocket public money with no questions asked. In my opinion, this is kind of sneaky and evil because wanting to privatize something like this just goes to show that people understand it's wrong, but they're still choosing to do it. The last source, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein, was a book that he wrote, and at the start of it he says, segregated neighborhoods did not result from individual prejudices, personal choices, or actions of such private institutions, but rather were a consequence of government action. Something important that I thought this video mentioned was that people often think that these problems are above us, but they're actually problems that were created by our ancestors that we are still trying to fix today. The video also mentioned that most Southern Democrats were okay with having integrated housing in the North, but they wanted to preserve segregation in the South. Even today, now that we have integrated housing, there are still predominantly white neighborhoods and predominantly black neighborhoods. What I learned from all of these sources is that racism is still very much alive today, and that segregation still exists today. Even with these laws in place, it's still very clear that people of color in this country do not have the same rights as somebody that's white. It saddens me to know that we need to have such laws written down in order to have the same rights as everybody else. Segregation is very much so still alive, and it's time that we fought for true equality.